Welcome to the BERcast, the Building Efficiency Resources podcast. We are the leader in the real news and updates and information for professionals in the building performance industry. And after a brief hiatus, I'm back here with my main man, Sandy Gallo, and we are going to be speaking with the folks from the Passive House Institute US. We're going to have Lisa White as well as Isaac Elnecave talking about the history of the program and some of the really amazing things that are going on in the world of passive buildings here in North America. So, Sandy, it's been a little bit since we talked last. How you been doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. It's back to normal Florida weather again, so I'm happy about that. 70s and 80s every day, and I'm doing great, Chris. I'm doing really well.
Nice. Well, I'm staring out a window, sort of looking at Lake Ontario. But we've got lots to cover here, Sandy. It's been 2-3 weeks since we've had an episode, so we got plenty of news to share here. So a agreement that's come out between 9 states to boost the adoption of heat pumps to basically 90% of all equipment by 2040, which is a significant pledge. Now, again, we've talked about these pledges that, people make them, you make them today and hey, 15 years from now, they were supposed to get it done. I think it's easier said than done. And, people have, short memories. They don't really remember what they pledged to 15 years ago. But this one seems somewhat real. It's a kind of a strange consortium of
It
states here.
is.
So you got a bunch of people from out east. Okay, well, minus this one. Yeah. So and then you get they decide to put them in alphabetical order here. So California, Colorado, those are out west, and as is Oregon. So it's interesting to see who's on here, and it's also interesting to sort of see who's not. Like you kind of think that if you had California and you had Oregon, you'd kind of assume what you might have Washington. So I don't know why they chose not to get involved with this. If you have Maine and you got Massachusetts, you might expect to see Vermont or Connecticut, but kind of interesting here
I
how
thought it was
this.
interesting that there was no southern states, at all.
Right. Yeah,
I
I
mean, I
mean, it's
thought
kind
that
of
was kind of
even
weird.
heat pumps are even more of a no-brainer there, so why not? But
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess it's sort of a messaging thing, right? So southern states may not want to join up with a bunch of blue states and make a commitment to something that sort of is pushing a green agenda, perhaps. Um, anyways, not legally binding, doesn't commit anybody to really do anything. We've heard this before. But the goal is that we're more than 50% of equipment in these states by 2030, which is a mere 6 years away from now. Is going to be heat pumps. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of a big deal.
And I think
And
the
so
bigger deal is the 90% by 2040. I think that's even a bigger deal. You know,
sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing. I guess again, 2040 to me feels like it's far enough away where it's like, sure, why not? I guess what, let's shoot for the moon. But if you think about 6 meager years, and you're taking some kind of cold places. I mean, Colorado is kind of cold. The standard of practice in residential new construction in Colorado still today probably is gas furnaces. Am I wrong?
no, I think you're right. Yep.
Yeah. Or even in Maryland, kind of
A lot
cold.
of gas.
Um, yeah, and yeah, and they use gas, and
And
I'd
there's
say
a
that
lot of gas programs in the Mid Atlantic. There's a lot of gas programs.
yep. And again, this is sales, so this isn't even just talking about new construction. So if you think about sales, what's the real market in equipment sales?
That's
It's
humongous.
existing systems, right?
Yep,
Change outs.
by far.
So we're not just talking about like let's electrify new buildings. This is talking about like people who have their 90% furnace, from, the 2000s or whatever, all of a sudden it's aged out at 30 years, and then people are going to be putting in heat pumps. So it's very ambitious. I'm interested to know exactly how their framework is going to push this because, there's a little bit more that goes into heat pumps. And again, we've talked this topic almost to death, but there's a lot that goes into the design of these systems, the installation. The one thing I've become a
Well, that
little
was the
bit,
one thing I think, though, Chris. I don't mean to interrupt you. Sorry, there. I mean to cut you off, but I think one part that's prevalent there is that they talk about workforce development in this, and I think again that falls in line with what we've been talking about the whole time. Is that it's not a magic box. People have to be trained how to install these things properly and design them, and so I was glad to see that. There's also a lot of talk about the IRA money in here, which makes sense. Um, but they say they're going to develop tools, but it doesn't really get into what kind of tool. You know what I mean? So I guess it's just a fledgling thing right now. But it talks about the same things that we've been talking about all along, which is the IRA and workforce development. Trying to train people how to install these systems, and they actually identified in this article that that was one of the biggest hurdles for the installers, and I agree with that.
yeah, well, that is the biggest challenge, right? Because, let's put ourselves in the perspective of a rank and file HVAC contractor, right? You're in the business of making money. What's one of your most profitable services?
Talking about existing home changeouts, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So change outs, because, the new construction market is actually very tough on trades. People misunderstand that. They think people are making tons
Low
of money
profit
off of
margin too.
yeah, low profit. My understanding is it's keeping people busy so that then, when
Yep.
they have, the existing homes work, which is more lucrative, service-based work. And then again, change outs. Why change outs? Because you can buy a piece of equipment as a contractor at wholesale rates for, substantially less than what their sort of, MSRP would be for a consumer, and then you mark it up by 50% or more. And it essentially, especially if you're not changing the configuration of the equipment, you're just swapping out box for box. Bada bing, bada boom. It's pretty easy, really, frankly speaking. Going from a gas furnace to a heat pump is not necessarily that straightforward. And there's going to be more consumer education that's necessary. Again, I think this is a great goal. I'm in favor of it because I do think that electrifying heating has a lot of benefit. But we also got to make sure we do this in the right order. Before people start electrifying heat, we really want to be reducing our loads, as we've talked about. And that kind of takes us into our next article here. So this was shared to us by our friend Tony Lasanti, our guest from a couple of episodes ago, where we were talking about his experience with grid utility management in New York State, and some of the ambitious goals in New York State as it pertains to electrification. And so, he shared this article that now operators, electric utilities in New York, are starting to feel the squeeze in winter as well as in summer. So, it basically used to be that, the grid was sized for the cooling load. And that's, that was shared to us by Tony. Makes sense. You got people air conditioning, and that ends up, causing there to be a peak demand somewhere there, probably in July or August. Well, now, the growth of electricity demand in winter at this current level is expected to exceed the growth of demand in the summer. And so basically, pretty soon by 2015 or 2050, winter demand is expected to surpass the electricity demand in summer. So that's pretty interesting because we kicked this episode off by sort of saying things are getting a little bit warmer, seemingly. And we're not getting as much snow. And so, in a lot of ways, you think, hey, the climate's moderating. So, a place like New York State, not a big deal. The heat loads are going to be smaller, but not necessarily. This article is making it out like, essentially, utility providers are preparing for a future where their peak demand is coming in the dead of winter. What do you think about that, Sandy?
Well, I think it makes sense. I mean, if you go into electrification and heat pump, utility demand is going to be greater in a winter because you have more colder months probably up there than you do hotter months. I mean, if you actually looked it out, and heat, people don't, I don't think people used um, heat any differently. You know what I mean? So, when it starts getting cold in the end of September, people are starting to use heat now instead of, in October. I mean, I froze to death on many Thanksgivings in November, up north. So, it was cold. So, I mean, it does make sense. I think it does present a whole, like we talked about in the episode with Tony, it does present a whole lot of problems with demand. And, a lot of those, like they go into this article about how a lot of those supplementary ways of supplying the grid with energy in the summertime necessarily won't work or will be worn out in the wintertime because they're using them, it's twice as much. So I thought it was, I think it ties right into what we were talking about with Tony, is that we do need to address grid issues and we're going to need to address them pretty fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And the article makes it clear, there's a lot of contributing factors, data centers, so all of a sudden there's a lot more consumption going on, even though we've basically made impacts in terms of efficiency. Now there's other things that use a lot of energy, but they're saying a major contributor to this trend is the conversion of fuel fired heating systems to electricity based heating systems. And that just makes sense. And the article says, hey, heat pumps,
Absolutely.
they're very efficient, except when temperatures go below 30 degrees. And obviously, there's better heat pumps out there. But it all goes down to design and selection, and this is, I'll tell you what, I'm a little bit nervous about how much there's this vogue trend pushing for heat pumps, not because I think heat pumps are problematic, but there's there's a lot of not very good heat pumps, or they're just fine, or maybe they're more appropriate for, warmer climates, down south, where very rarely you're seeing, severe weather under 30. But I kind of feel like we have the risk of homogenizing what these systems are, and people just go, oh yeah, just throw in a heat pump, and then they select the 14 seer, you know 8.5 HSPF system in upstate New York, and then all of a sudden people are getting killed with energy bills. So,
Right.
and the system can't really keep up. So, devil's in the details, Sandy, as you and I know. But it's not just a New York State thing. The article points out that the Tennessee Valley Authority, which basically, is the main utility provider in a southern 7-state region in, mainly the southeast, and they had their highest peak ever in the dead of winter. And so, they were able to handle it, but they have a lot more grid side management that they're having to focus on for these cold snaps. That, as you pointed out, while up north, we may be getting a little bit warmer and more moderate. It seems like, we're having more examples of extreme cold weather in places that were less used to that previously. So, kind of interesting stuff. So,
Very much so.
what can we do about this, issue? Is there anything we can do, in order to address, the fact that we've got these extreme peaks? We can adopt better building codes. And so, quick update here in the world of building codes: Illinois has recently adopted a version of the 2021 IECC. It went into effect for all new buildings as of January 1st, 2024. It is basically the 2021 IECC as written, with a couple of very minor weakening amendments, but for all intents and purposes, they really adopted the code almost as written. So now, similar to Massachusetts, Illinois has basically moved to have a stretch code, which municipalities can choose to opt into. The stretch code has been in development here over the last few years. I think originally the goal was to time it where that the stretch code would come out at the same time as the base code, but they had to spend more time fine tuning it. And being someone who was sort of moderately involved in the process as a public commenter, I'm actually very happy with what they came up with. So, essentially the goal that they're trying to push for is an EUI, and we'll just focus on residential. They want an EUI basically of about 50% of the 2006 IECC. When you compare apples to apples, and EUI, we don't talk about that about EUIs in the HERS industry, but EUIs are basically just the energy intensity per square foot of the building. So if you've got a 2,000 square foot house, and you're using how many ever, you know, kilowatt hours, on an annualized basis, then you can basically divide that total consumption by your square footage, and that gives you your EUI. So as you make building codes more efficient, then we can say, well, we're targeting a reduction in the EUI. And I'll say again, for us being in the HERS industry and we're used to quantifying a lot of different things, we don't talk about EUIs very much. But in the policy world, that's like the wonky term. That's what they're looking for is a reduction in EUI. So 50% is the goal by June 30th of this year. So basically, kicking in at July of this year, buildings that are in these opt-in stretch code communities are going to have to be hitting this more advanced version of the energy code, which is targeting 50% savings versus the 2006 IECC. Sandy, what's another way that in our industry we might quantify that goal?
ERI.
Yeah, sure. An ERI of 50. So let's take a look. What did they come up with their residential stretch code? So going forward, we'll skip all the different administrative chapters, and we'll just go to the good stuff in section 401. So it kind of looks like the standard code, but of course the devil's in the details. So there's a prescriptive option, a total building performance option, aka the simulated performance alternative, and then there's an ERI option. I guess I probably shouldn't have skipped too much because it's worth mentioning that the code does specifically make reference to above code programs as being equivalent, specifically buildings built to passive house standards. So if you build a passive house, you're good to go. Otherwise, you have to go through either the prescriptive path plus the energy package options from R408, or you got to go through the total building performance option, or you got to go through the ERI. So, what do we got in terms of a prescriptive approach? Well, not too much when it comes to the building envelope. There were no updates to the 2021 IECC for the building envelope, but there is information that deals with equipment. So, different controls specifically for equipment, for water heating and space heating. And then a lot more information that is required for section R404 dealing with electric vehicle power infrastructure, electric readiness of the building, et cetera, et cetera. And so, in a lot of ways, this is kind of priming on a prescriptive basis that buildings are going to be more, it's basically set up for a net zero electrified future. On a performance basis, pretty similar to what the base code is, except that you have to be 71% of the site energy of the reference design. So typically for those who do performance code compliance, usually, basically your your proposed home or your AKA your rated home for the performance path just has to equal the or be less than the proposed energy use of the reference home. For this, we got to be 71% of it. So basically, it's saying you got to save almost 30% on a performance basis relative to that reference design. Um, okay, well, that's a little bit tricky. I'm not sure if I
Yeah.
would want to go that path if I was a builder. Let's see what we got for the ERI. Did they leave it? Did they gut it? Let's check it out. Okay, I found this to be very interesting. Our goals uh, for the ERI, if you do an ERI with an all electric home, then basically the ERI targets are the same as the base code. There's no required improvement. If you have combustion equipment, so if you have fossil fuel based space heating or water heating, now you got to drop down to basically an ERI or a HERS index of 50. So that goes back to that, zero point 0.5 EUI target being, 50% of the 2006 IECC. As we all know, the ERI is a calculation based off of comparison to the 2006 IECC. So look at that. If you're building with, furnaces or gas fired water heaters, basically you got to have a HERS index of 50 to meet this stretch code. You know what? If I'm a builder, I'm probably going to kick the tires on that option because it seems like it's a little bit more straightforward, something I'm more used to. And I'll just say this is a huge opportunity for energy raters. The state of
Yeah.
Illinois, I hate to say it, but the state of Illinois hasn't always been the most welcoming environment for energy raters. It's been a tough road to hoe for a lot of raters out there selling the merits of the HERS index and the ERI. Illinois typically is kind of lagging behind the nation in terms of the penetration of HERS indices or ERI ratings. So I don't know. What do you think about this, Sandy? Do you think that builders may kick the tires a little bit more on the ERI?
I have no doubt about it, especially if the raters present it right as a co-compliance option, because I think it does make sense. And I mean, if I was a builder, I would definitely be looking at ERI. Especially in this case with the Illinois new stretch code. We converted many people over our careers to doing ERI or performance path. And once they understand it and you show them what you can do with it and how what a good compliance method it is, most people are sold. So I would say, yeah, I think this is awesome, and I think it opens up the door for HERS raters in Illinois for sure.
Yeah, the other thing I like about this too is they got rid of some of the goofiness with the base code of the ventilation alterations of the calculation of the ERI. And we won't go into that brutal history, but if you know, you know. Some goofiness happened in both the 2018 IECC as well as the 2021 that kind of mucked up the ERI calculation. Basically, they're saying it's a straight ERI or basically a straight HERS index. And I think that that's a pretty good option. So, you know, I used to live in Illinois. I have family in Illinois. It is a state that stays near and dear to my heart, and I'm really pulling for our HERS Rater partners in the state of Illinois to be able to get out there and start to sell the merits of what they're doing. Because, I will say, as these goals, these loftier goals for EUI savings continue to happen. So, because it's not just about, July of this year, all of a sudden in another year and a half, then homes are going to have to
Yeah.
be even that much more better. So, how much you go about demonstrating that, Sandy?
That's going to be a tough one, I can tell you that. But
Yeah, I
one
mean,
thing I
now we're
would
talking
do
about a
is,
HERS.
but the one way I would demonstrate that is with using 310, right? I mean, that would help you along. So, I mean, that would be the first method I would take.
Yep, but I mean, basically in 2026, they're going to be looking at in stretch code communities at HERS indices essentially of 40, and then all of a sudden in 2029, HERS indices of the low 30s, and then the mid 20s you're only going to get to these levels basically with heat pumps and or with on-site renewable power. It's pretty much almost impossible to get down into the low 40s or into the 30s with combustion based equipment. There's just not that much savings. And yeah, to your point, if you combine a heat pump installation with ResNet HVAC grading procedures, it is extremely potent in terms of its savings on the HERS index, up to 6 or more points
Yeah.
potentially. So not necessarily something that people got to be paying a whole lot of attention to right now, but we got some big opportunities coming up here, Sandy. A couple episodes we saw New York State going all electric in 2026. In Illinois, at least the stretch code communities, they're going to be really pushing all electric buildings in 2026. And Massachusetts is already going there. They have a stretch code that's kicking in this year that is pushing electrifying heating. And, basically you're going to have indices in the 40s. So this stuff, it's no longer the thing of the future. It's the thing of now.
It's knocking on the door. Yeah.
Yeah, so time to get prepared, Raiders. Time to go get your 310 credential from good old building efficiency resources. You don't got to take it through us, but we have had a lot of success in teaching it. And, it definitely, especially once you start getting into heat pumps, it makes a big difference on the index. Or if you're in a cooling dominated climate, then honestly it makes a big difference just in terms of cooling savings and can really, help the HERS index as well. So plus let's, forget about the HERS index. The biggest reason why we're doing this stuff is, again, what is it about, Sandy? Properly designed systems, properly selected systems, and then properly installed systems with testing and verification. Isn't that what it's all about ultimately, Sandy?
It's what it's ultimately all about. And if we do all of those things, we'll be successful.
And that's what we got to push for, folks, because it is coming. It is getting put into the code. It is happening now. Not every single state, but many states are pushing for this. Got states pushing for, ambitious heat pump equipment change out goals. We have states making their energy code require or practically require heat pumps. So we have to get it right because, again, we already have the people who manage the grid. And these are not politicians. These are not people picking sides. These are just people doing the math and saying, hey, we have to manage these loads. If we get it wrong, it's not good. So let's step up to the plate. Let's get it right. Let's figure out how to do this stuff because that's what our job is for people. I'm excited about the prospects here. So
I would just add to that that, never before in all the years that you and I have been in this business has it been more important for a Raider to be on his game. And I think that, as Raiders, this is a giant opportunity, but with a caveat that you have to be prepared. And you're going to get prepared by education and training. So keep that in mind. At some point you're either going to be ahead of the pack or behind the pack or left behind. And I think that Raiders really have a giant opportunity coming up over the next few years everywhere to have a huge impact on the outcome of all of this. So that's all I would end that with.
no doubt. Well, and I'll say one big opportunity we have to get it right is through the adoption of passive building standards. Let's make these buildings as energy efficient as possible before we electrify them so that we are not doing, or putting undue stress on the electrical grid. If we smash those heat loads so that they are, 1/10 or 1/20th of what we would anticipate that they would be with a normal building, if you're essentially eliminating those heat loads for all practical purposes, as well as moderating cooling loads, that is the way to get electrification right. And that's why we're bringing on our good friends from the Passive House Institute US for segment 2. So we'll go ahead and roll into that and talk with those folks then. We are very privileged to have two esteemed colleagues joining us from the Passive House Institute US. My colleagues Lisa White and Isaac Elnecave. How's it going, y'all? Thanks for joining the BERcast.
Good to be here.
Great, thanks for
Welcome,
having
guys.
us.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, I have a personal history with PHIUS. I was their QA manager for their residential program, basically working with the raters as they were submitting projects to make sure that they were had consistent documentation and good technical support in a subcontracted role, basically between 2013 and I don't know 2018, something like that, until I passed off the torch to our good buddy on the BERcast, Tony Lasanti. Tony has taken over the reins and works with the folks at PHIUS and the Raiders and whatnot. But I'm still involved with PHIUS as a instructor for their verifier program. We just had a class of 25 people in Boston taking the verifier training. It was awesome. It was so cool to be back in front of people and to teach that class. I was sort of the key, person who helped to develop that training. And we've been teaching it on Zoom, and I've been saying, I don't like teaching it on Zoom anymore. Please don't make me do it. I really want to get out in front of people. And Isaac was like, you probably should go to Boston because we're going to have the need for more verifiers, and we're going to tell you why. But before we go there, Lisa, just maybe give us a little bit for those who don't know about PHIUS. Tell us a little bit about PHIUS, the history, and what makes the program unique and special.
Sure, I'll try to be brief here. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and at least when I joined about 12 years ago, the mission was to make high-performance passive building mainstream. We've kind of revised our mission a little bit because we're already reaching that goal. And now our mission is that every building supports the health of people and the planet. So a little broader and really thinking beyond just passive building. It's a little bit about the history. Thinking of how to make passive building mainstream, we had to think of kind of all the different parties involved. So we started and set out by our executive director built her own home to passive building standards back in early 2000s. And then we started applying these principles in the US and learned over time that basically the passive building principles work differently in different climates. So we set out to create a passive building standard for North America that works within the climates of North America. And the first version of that was released in 2015. Alongside that, maybe the 3 years prior is what I'm most familiar with. We also did some important things with our standard, which was partner with the US organizations, the EPA, Department of Energy, Energy Star, and Indoor Plus, and ResNet to get the quality assurance elements into the program. While all of this was happening too, we realized we also needed to train the people that were designing and constructing and verifying these buildings. So the consultant training, the designers, architects, engineers came a little bit earlier, trained all those people, but realized we didn't have the workforce that knew how to construct these buildings. So then developed a builder training program that launched in 2012. And I think the rater training just after that, and the verifier maybe just a few years after that for the larger scale construction. So it kind of all grew organically as we saw the market needs develop with kind of in tandem with the standard. Let's see, the organization itself has grown dramatically in the past few years from a staff perspective. I think we are over double what we were 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. We're in the 20s now, which is still pretty low, but we were for a while a fairly small organization with a pretty wide reach. I think we are still.
I remember those small meetings at your office.
Yes.
It was you and Kat and me and a couple of mics. and
Yep.
not too many other people really.
No,
You know,
yeah. We all wear a lot of hats. So the exciting part is that we're getting to distribute those hats and really form more solid kind of departments and working groups that can help propel this forward. And it's very exciting growth to see, but we're also still small relative to the market demand as that keeps increasing. And we'll probably talk a bit more about that later on in this.
yeah, you know, and Isaac, in some ways, I mean, you were almost a catalyzing presence. It was right about the time that I was stepping out of being the QA manager. You kind of stepped into the organization, and you and I had a previous relationship from a past life. You know, but you seemed like you joined the organization, and then like right after that, it was like boom, you know, in terms of staff development and whatnot. What's been your experience now? What you've been with the organization for 5 years?
4.5, 4.5 years. Yeah, I started, I think, I started in September 2019, right around the time, as Lisa's saying, where they were transitioning. And I had, I came in with kind of more or less two hats. One, as you were talking about, I came in and started doing a lot of the work on the QA as under Tony Lasanti, moving those projects forward. But as you just kind of implied, I have a policy background, and so I started also working on policy across the country, kind of with the aim as for PHIUS's mission to really start trying to make it mainstream and using policy as a lever. So we really started working on systematizing and quantifying incentive programs, basically to get start getting people over the hump, that original hump where they are uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and give them some incentive, usually monetary. Worked in with a lot of the work on the low income housing tax credit, because we were finding that multifamily was a really interesting niche spot for PHIUS, along with the single family. And then, as you implied, I have a background in energy codes, and started working on incorporating PHIUS into energy codes around the country. And that's been these kinds of three things have kind of, along with, I might add, the what subsequently came as the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which worked very much in conjunction with PHIUS, has really started moving the market towards PHIUS in a number of places. And
Okay.
so,
Excellent. Yeah, you know, and I guess, you know, part of what I want to point out here too is just, you know, for those who don't live and breathe passive buildings, you know, what is the sort of the essence? What are we trying to do? And honestly, I think that y'all's website has come a long way, and I love this branding here. You know, zero is the goal, PHIUS is the means. And I love this because, you know, Sandy and I have spent a lot of time on the BERcast talking about the need to sequence electrification appropriately. So, you know, Sandy and I are both environmentalists. We want clean air, clean water, clean food, all the rest of that. We're not going to have that. We don't have that currently with our current fossil fuel driven economy. It causes a lot of negative impacts to human health and the health of ecosystems. So Sandy and I are huge proponents of electrifying buildings to get to net zero across the board. But you can't just go and throw heat pumps in buildings and act like they're a magic pill. And there's a risk, we feel, that a lot of the branding of electrification risks potentially watering down the actual the practical challenges of design and installation of heat pumps and electrifying buildings. And more importantly, phasing appropriately, getting your loads down low enough to the point where it makes sense to electrify buildings from both a cost standpoint as well as from a grid side management. Because, you know, if we just throw a lot of heat pumps not well designed, not well selected, and not well installed into not well insulated or air sealed buildings with a lot of thermal bridges, we're potentially going to cause a lot of problems. We're concerned about that. And we're trying to get people to, I know everybody wants to kiss their heat pump water heater and say that that's good enough, but I'm telling you folks, we got to think critically about this. And this is not just because of my history working with PHIUS, but I truly believe that PHIUS is the means. The je ne sais quoi of the program is essentially smashing heat loads, almost practically eliminating them, and then being very thoughtful about the design principles for the other major loads, space cooling loads, water heating loads, as well as the selection of, the other, electrical loads in the building, lighting and appliances, process loads, etc. How did you all get to this branding? Because I just think it's great, and I think it really does sum up kind of the value proposition for PHIUS.
Sure. I'd like to just echo what you have in an or said in an echo chamber. Like, it's so critical to reduce the loads before electrifying. This is something I've been focusing on over the past few years. But really, we got to this branding because it became evident in the market that net zero was this like ultimate goal. But or at least a few years ago. I don't think that's our real goal. But it became evident that was a goal. But if you don't conserve first, net zero really isn't. It's not a good goal. Like, we can't forget about the conservation. We can't forget about the low loads, and we can't forget about the other things that aren't even energy related that bring health and durability and quality to a building. So we're like, okay, yeah, maybe net zero is the goal, but not if you don't do all these other things first. And the challenge for me with net zero is you can have any building and add renewable energy and it can be net zero. So to me, it's a watered brand. So we want to make sure you take this conservation and quality first approach to zero. And that's really what PHIUS is trying to be. And the other big thing that PHIUS brings is the opportunity for many buildings that maybe didn't have enough roof area to be zero before conservation. If you apply the PHIUS principles, passive building standard, and reduce energy loads by, say, 50%, now, all of a sudden you have enough roof space and net zero becomes achievable. So it kind of just all fits together nicely, but we didn't want conservation to be left in the past when net zero was the goal.
Yeah, well, so critical because this, grid management is going to be really critical. I mean, obviously, we're moving to electrify transportation at the same time that we want to electrify heating and water heating, even in cold climates. And those are ambitious but righteous goals, but
Yep.
they could be done wrong. And that's, Sandy and I have gotten a little bit of flack on the BERcast where it seems like we're pumping the brakes on electrification or we don't like heat pumps. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's just that we have enough experience to know that if done not so thoughtfully, we
Sure.
could potentially get ourselves into some trouble where all of a sudden there's a lot of consumer and political backlash against a lot of these concepts. So,
sure. And if I can just add some recent research we did at PHIUS under the AI Upjohn grant. I don't know if you've heard about this, but we essentially first we looked at all the implications of electrification on load profiles, but really with the goal of looking at a hypothetical neighborhood and electrifying it existing, or if you upgraded the neighborhood first and then electrified it, and what kind of like the grid level impacts would be of that. And so we looked at this hypothetical neighborhood in Milwaukee, gave it all the same electrified equipment, and then said, if I want to power this neighborhood on renewable energy with the existing neighborhood electrified and with the PHIUS compliant neighborhood electrified, and it's exponential, the differences in renewable generation capacity and energy storage needed to support the existing neighborhood with all the same, we call it high performance equipment versus the PHIUS compliant enclosures first. So we really need to think about that in the energy transition. And if we're all the new loads, swapping out fossil fuel generation with renewables, like it's all works together. And still the low load is the most important part.
Well, yeah, and and it's not just about energy either.
No.
There's a really cool study that came out last year from PNNL and NREL talking about enhancing resiliency of buildings through energy efficiency. And essentially, the punchline of this study is that by moving buildings to being compliant with at least the 2021 IECC, but even more importantly, going all the way to passive, and specifically they called out PHIUS standards,
Yeah.
that there can be a dramatic improvement in survivability for occupants if there was an event where the grid were to implode. So let's imagine here
Hmm.
we are sloppily installing, inappropriately sized and selected heat pumps, and that in combination with, some extreme weather causes a collapse of the grid. If you have the existing building stock, that poses a risk to people's health. So, Isaac, you're a policy guy, you're a codes guy. What do we always hear? Energy codes, they're not life safety standards. We don't care about those energy codes. They're not worthy in the same way as, gas and fire code and things like that. Yeah, I'm sorry, folks, but buildings can keep people alive if done appropriately. And that's what this study shows, that basically in several climates. Let's just take Atlanta. There's a lot of building down south, and I think people would go, screw it. You don't need to do passive house down south. It's not that it's more moderate. Well, but what it found is if you go all the way to PHIUS, that you can increase the habitability compared to the existing building stock by like 5 times, and
Wow.
significantly better than even the 2021 IECC. And this is not PHIUS producing this study. This is coming from a federal government research study. And so, in Portland, Oregon, again, increasing the survivability in summertime in an extreme climate event. And so, same thing here in Detroit. It doesn't get you quite as farther, but it'll buy you another day if you go all the way to PHIUS standards versus, you're going to be shivering and potentially not doing very well in an existing building where I live in the dead of winter, unfortunately. So we got to move people potentially to these higher building performance standards for survivability, for resilience. So, there's a lot more that goes into passive house than just trying to prime us for net zero. I think that that's sort of the obvious, but I really like hearing from you, Lisa, that the program is setting higher ambitions to really talk about, essentially the goals of creating healthy, resilient, and climate friendly buildings into the future.
Right. And our senior scientists kind of coined that passive building is a shield and a sword toward climate change, because the resilience aspect of outages and more natural disasters, kind of the shield to that, and then the sword to it with slashing emissions and reducing, operational emissions in buildings. So I kind of like that approach and thinking about it from both perspectives.
Right. Well, that's awesome. And going back to Isaac, as a policy professional, you've really been busy here because there are huge opportunities for building to PHIUS standards that are coming into building codes all around the country. In segment one, our news section, I showed basically an update from Illinois, the home state where PHIUS is based, where in Illinois, for both the base code, which is based off of the 2021 IECC, as well as the stretch code, homes can demonstrate compliance with the code by building PHIUS. Were you involved in that process, Isaac?
Yes, I was, particularly actually in both. I was involved um, in the base code development, and both in the base code and the stretch code development. I also wanted to add that that's also been included in the new Chicago code as well.
Okay,
So it's
great.
got full coverage across the state. And one of the reasons that it's been successful, and I want to get to Massachusetts in just a second, but one of the reasons it's been successful, and I think it's something I also want to emphasize, is the work that PHIUS does to certify the buildings, provides kind of a third party approach to ensuring that buildings are meeting both the PHIUS standard and essentially code. I won't tell you who, but I was told specifically by a person in Chicago that the reason PHIUS was included as part of the alternative compliance path that you just mentioned is because this is a way for them to have certainty that the energy side of the equation is going to be handled well, because a lot of a lot of municipalities have always had issues and constraints about being able to do full compliance. So they can then focus on those things that you were talking about. They can focus on fire safety. They can focus on structural, knowing that the energy side through PHIUS is covered, and that gives you a kind of both an incentive to move forward on more advanced codes, but also the incentive to make sure that they're done correctly.
Yeah, Sandy, we've been hearing this all over the place for the last few years.
Yep.
Third-party verification energy codes and the value that provides to municipalities. What do you think about this? The city of Chicago saying, we're going to go ahead and we're going to adopt PHIUS, as an alternative compliance because we know it's going to be done right.
I think it's a testament to what the raters are doing, and I think that one opportunity that we've talked a lot about in the ResNet realm, right, is the push and our training for the IEC residential energy inspector plans examiner, and the fact that we can have we're the experts, right? So why wouldn't we enforce this energy side of these things? So I think it makes complete sense, and it really falls in line with I think where the market is going eventually anyway. Where your rater is going to be your energy code compliance expert and push the envelope to making sure that compliance is correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so Illinois, big opportunities there, but even bigger, again, we mentioned I just taught a class of 25 verifiers in the city of Boston. The reason why is the state of Massachusetts has adopted not only a stretch code, but also a specialized opt-in code, which goes even beyond the stretch code. And this specialized opt-in code has been adopted by the city of Boston, and it requires essentially all new multifamily buildings over 12,000 square feet, which is most of them, to be PHIUS certified. Is that correct, Isaac?
Yeah, and I'll go even further. It's been adopted by the city of Boston and 32 other municipalities across the state. It's covering about a third of the population, and it includes some of the cities, some of the major secondary cities. It covers Cambridge, Brookline, Somerville, Watertown, Newton. So a lot of the major population centers are covered here, and that's what's driving. And it goes back to it. That's what's driving the verifier training. All of a sudden, there's a lot of people, a lot of verifiers, a lot of raters in the state of Massachusetts who are seeing that there's going to be probably on the order of about 100 to 120 multifamily buildings built in the state in a given year, based on previous construction levels. Now, we don't know how that changes, but if you kind of go back to 2019, the 33 cities built about 110, 115 multifamilies. Those are all going to have to be passive house.
Folks, this is mind blowing. Like, this is not like little stuff. This is a big catalyzing change. You're talking about a significantly progressive state in Massachusetts that sort of is, in a lot of ways, a leading edge for a lot of the rest of the country. Adopting and enforcing that in some of the major population centers, all multifamily buildings have to be passive buildings. This is a tremendous opportunity, but I'd imagine it also poses a little bit of a challenge, right, Isaac? Because, when I got involved in this, don't get me wrong, there was a lot of energy around passive buildings, but frankly speaking, it was like, the cool kids club for the wonk, for the true believer environmentalists, the people who were doing this because they thought it was the right thing to do. and some of them who were ahead of the curve in terms of knowing that it was a business savvy thing to do. But now we're moving away from the realm of the true believers to basically just the shrewd business people building buildings. And they may have been planning these buildings for years, and now they have to build them passive house. Has that been a challenge at all for you in having to kind of deal with more of that sort of market developer, facing side of the development cycle?
Well, yes, and I kind of view it. The metaphor that I keep thinking about is it's a little bit of a wall. And on one side is the existing construction infrastructure. On the other side of the wall is PHIUS. And so what we really are working in terms of training and in development and in experience is getting these people over that wall. And it's going to be a little bumpy. But that's the part that's really interesting because we're in transition phase. So there's a lot of people, as you said, they're no longer just the true believers, but there's a lot of people who are saying, okay, developers, and this includes developers, architects, engineers, right? Mechanical engineers who have to work through this, structural engineers, builders, subcontractors, right? All the electricians, all the carpenters, who now have to think through kind of a slightly different or somewhat different way of construction than they're used to. We're in that phase where we are getting all these people, this kind of the second group, not just the leading edge people, but the second group, trained and comfortable and experienced with this. And that's in a sense really the really exciting part, because once that second group, which is a much larger group than the true believers as you were talking about, become comfortable with PHIUS and experience with PHIUS, then all of a sudden the market opens up, because all of a sudden these people are no longer hesitant. The developers are no longer hesitant to build to PHIUS, because they know how to do it, and they realize, hey, this isn't going to be a particularly low. There's a small, if any, maybe in some cases none, no incremental cost, and we have the construction. We have all the carpenters, we have the electricians, we have the plumbers, we have the GCs, we have the verifiers, who can do this. And so what really is like right now we're in that transition phase because the code the code came into effect more or less in January, for a number of the main cities, including Boston. So we are in the front end of this, but when we get to the other side of that wall, it'll be almost like, why didn't we do this from the beginning? I know that
Absolutely.
sounds.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. I mean, I'm agreeing with you wholeheartedly. I kind of think about it like, you know, I got my career started right around the time that lead was starting to become a little bit more mainstream. And back then everybody and their mom was becoming a lead AP because it was the new thing to do. And, and I think lead's taken a lot of, you know, they've taken a lot of criticism for maybe not focusing on energy performance enough. And probably rightfully so. But I will say the thing that they've done successfully is nobody knew what a VOC was or anything in terms of, better building materials back in 2008, 2009. But when everybody went through this training, and to understand it, now it's mainstream. Now all of these products in the big box stores are labeled for this stuff. And, rank and file general laborers and contractors, they know a thing or two about green building practices. And
Right.
so, it's similar to like, back in 2009 with the 2009 IECC, blower door testing was not mandatory by code before. All of a sudden, then blower door and duct blaster testing became mandatory. And like it took a while for people to pick it up. And there's still some areas of the country that still don't know that it's a requirement. But nevertheless, there's a lot more just general contractors, who understand that this stuff exists. Sandy, how did you see things change in the residential sector just from, the advance of energy codes?
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, I watched it when, you know, basically when I got into this business, you had your true believers, and I started on the direct provider side working for large national organizations, and, we did a lot of co-compliance stuff, in areas that was required, but, mostly HERS Ratings or Energy Star were the true believers of the companies that, used energy as a pillar of their value proposition or as a market separation device, right? Because, you compare it to a code home and you could use that, where I've seen it just with the advance of code, once people get to used to doing duct blasters and blower door for code, then it's not so hard to go to hers. It's not so hard to go to Energy Star. And they start as code as advanced, it's become more and more reasonable and makes more sense for the builders and et cetera. So I think that there's been, a major opportunity. And that kind of brings me to a question for you guys is that, you know, my whole career, almost going on 20 years, I've heard nothing but, oh, it costs so much money. It costs so much money. And no one ever talks about ROI, though, right? I mean, everybody talks about initial costs, but nobody talks about the return on investment. I'd like to hear you guys' perspective on that because, when I ask that question, I mean, you could take it from any perspective that you want, but like, what are the, like about how much more does it cost, say, to build a passive house, versus, what the return on investment is? Because I think that's important for people to know.
I think we have to view it from a very holistic perspective in that right now we're looking in Massachusetts where the infrastructure is growing and is improving. We're looking at about a 2 to 3% incremental cost.
Yes, yeah.
And I think part of the reason is that a lot of the work that we've done beforehand primed the market, it increased the experience, it increased the knowledge. And as we increase the knowledge, the experience, the comfort level, where people learn how to do designs for PHIUS up front, where people brought in all of the various construction professionals up front and did the designs and did a holistic designs, thinking with PHIUS as part of it. We've seen the construction incremental costs drop. So it's not even a matter, I mean, the ROI is very important. You're looking at a 30 to 40% improvement over code. But what's more important is that the cost itself will drop. We've seen it almost everywhere.
Yeah.
And that just comes in from experience, and that comes in from comfort levels.
And that was the perfect answer because, I call BS on that whole narrative, right? I mean, it's gotten to the point now where, I mean, you think about it, 30 to 40% ROI for a 2% investment is incredible, and that's, thanks to the work you guys have done in the past and, the work of many building performance professionals and construction people, learning, understanding, and products and all the things that have happened today. So that was a great answer, and I appreciate that, Isaac.
Yeah, Lisa, what do you think? What's your take?
I just want to get back to this wall analogy, and what you guys have been talking about. I'd really like to turn that into a ramp. I don't think it's a wall. I don't think passive building really is on the other side of this unknown territory, especially with what Chris and Sandy were just saying, like building energy codes and things over time have advanced the market, and we're slowly kind of building to that high performance level. So when we're talking about incremental cost, the question is, what's the baseline? So if you're looking in somewhere that's already almost at the top of that ramp with really good energy codes and has, a trained market, incremental cost is really low. But if you're looking at somewhere at the bottom of that ramp and, they don't have energy codes and they have to meet PHIUS, the incremental cost could be 10%. It's like, what is it relative to? And I think that's been one of the most challenging conversations for us, for others to understand is that there isn't a sweet spot number. But if you get the same types of buildings and the same climate, like Massachusetts, for example, we are seeing real data to 1 to 3% incremental cost. And then the savings depends on, what do you pay for your utilities in the jurisdiction? And are those prices increasing? You actually could get more savings than you originally predicted with kind of the volatility of utility and electricity pricing moving forward. So it's variable, but we know it pays back.
Yeah, and I'll just say, if you all have more interest in this, you want to understand what this program's really about, get involved, go take a training. Honestly, I learned so much from Lisa when I took the CPHC training. It was mind blowing. When I first got involved with the program back in the 2013, 2014, something like that. I thought I knew a lot about building science until I took class with Lisa, and then I learned that there's a lot more to the details of it. But I think once you start to really get involved, you start to realize a lot of this is just common sense. Like, take where you're at, Sandy. Let's just not allow all the sun to come in the windows at bad times where we're not going to be able to make use of it. Like, let's just design the building a little bit more practically. That's more, again, what this je ne sais quoi. What is passive? Smash the loads, heating and cooling. Can we reduce these loads so that we don't have to throw so much mechanical energy at it, amongst other things? All right. Unfortunately, we do got to wrap up here. But before we do, I just got to say, have you watched The Curse?
Uh-huh. Yes, I have.
Oh, she's watched The Curse. Paramount Plus is not so it's somewhat panned because it's weird. It's just a weird show. It's kind of creepy, kind of cringy, but they talk about passive buildings. The theme of this series is that there is a couple that is somewhat dysfunctional and egotistical trying to save an impoverished neighborhood outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, with building passive buildings. And this is what they think a passive building looks like. Apparently, you have to have mirror faces on the outside of a cube for it to be passive building. But honestly, the show talks about some things that are right about passive house, reducing thermal bridging and, better insulation details. There's a blower door scene where they're testing with smoke, but it also gets a lot of things wrong about passive buildings. It implies that you cannot have mechanical heating and cooling in them. But I don't know, Lisa, what's your take on this show?
A blessing and a curse, not
Right.
No pun intended with the title.
A curse, right?
I was so excited to see a show that actually said passive house. I had people like sending it to me, and then as it goes on, I'm like, I wish like some of this was just more true. And then the show just gets like crazier and crazier. So it's like, I wish it was just introduced in a setting that wasn't so satirical. But either way, I think it's going to bring light to a concept. I did just send a link around that someone from Sunset Magazine reached out to us to kind of debunk what passive building is after this show. So I think it's going to bring a little more attention to the concept, and we have the opportunity to say, no, there's not going to be air pockets in your building. You're not going to get stuck to the ceiling. Weird things that happened in this show that, you don't need to air seal your baby's room to keep them comfortable.
Ignore the last episode.
Yeah,
and,
but
and, and you'll be all good.
I'm glad it happened, but I wish it was in a different show that was less.
Hey, you know what? No press is bad press, right? If we're talking about passive buildings in the mainstream, showing blower door testing in the mainstream, cool. Even if it's in a weird and creepy type of show, that's all good. Good deal. All right. Thanks very much, folks. Thanks for being on the BERcast, and we look forward to more awesome opportunities for the Passive House Institute US moving forward in the future.
Thanks, guys. This is awesome.
Thanks so much for having us.
All right, segment 3 here, Sandy. Real quick, we're not going to go on too much longer because people have been telling us, Sandy, Chris, y'all run your mouth too much. We love the BERcast, but you all got to wrap it up. They got the old wrap it up box, and come on, wrap it up. We all know from the Chappelle Show. I can't help myself. I love talking this stuff with Sandy. But last time that you and I spoke, we were looking into the NFL playoffs, and my Detroit Lions, we were like, we're not sure if these guys are going to get out of the first round. Not only did they get out of the first round, they won 2 playoff games. They went to the NFC Championship, and they blew it. No, they blew it. They were so close.
They were.
They had a 19-point lead or whatever it was going into the third quarter, and then Gambling Dan Campbell, Mas Cajones que Cerebro. What was I telling you, Sandy?
He lost that game. I'm sorry. I mean, let's call it is what it is. But I will say this: you shouldn't be disappointed. They had a great season, and remember, if you look back at the history of great teams, they usually lose their first championship game, and then they come back roaring the next year. Usually, so I would say that the future is very bright for Detroit. So let's talk about the Super Bowl itself, because I think that's the more interesting part of this whole thing. And there's a lot of already people going on and on about Patrick Mahomes and his greatness, and I don't think it's illegitimate. But they've already started to unseat Tom Brady as the greatest of all time, and I would just say we might need to slow down on that a little bit. I think that he has definitely cemented himself. I mean, look, he won that game for them, against the 49ers. There's no question about that. The guy is a great player. And he's probably one of the best ever. There's no question about that. Don't quite think he unseated Brady yet, though. Let me see what it looks like in 20 years. We got to remember that, right? Brady had a 20+ year career, winning the Super Bowl in his 40s, with the Buccaneers. After they said they couldn't do it, after being with the same team all those years to win 6, he won 7, right? So, but besides that, I think what we saw in the Super Bowl was 2 evenly matched teams, but one had a better quarterback. That's how I would sum it up. And the difference between Brock Purdy and Patrick Mahomes is Patrick Mahomes is a better quarterback, and in the end, he won it. What do you think about that, Chris?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, San Francisco, I will say, as much as the Lions blew it in their game against San Francisco, I think that the 49ers totally blew it. There was so many missed opportunities for them to take advantage of mistakes and frankly speaking, just lethargic play by the Chiefs. Honestly, I hate to say it, but that was the boring bowl. 3/4 of that game were a sleeping pill. It was on pace to be the worst Super Bowl of all time. And
it was like yawn.
Yeah, I mean, it picked up the pace there in the fourth quarter, and they went to overtime, so for a somewhat dramatic ending. But yeah, I mean, look, all credit where credit is due. Patrick Mahomes pulled it out big for my buddies down there in Kansas City. We got some Raiders down there that couldn't be happier. And so I'm happy for them. Obviously, I was salty about the 49ers, so I'm fine with them losing. I'm happy to rep my Midwestern team, the Kansas City Chiefs. I think it's too soon to be, putting the stamp on Mahomes quite yet, but he's got a lot of room to continue to grow and develop. Like he's honestly, the sky is the limit. He really has the potential. I mean, I would almost be interested to see at their respective ages who's ahead, and I'm not a big enough football nerd to have looked that up, but I don't know. You got.
I think they're pretty actually neck and neck. Actually, I think they're pretty neck and neck. Mahomes going to be 30, and I think at the age 30, I think, if I remember correctly, I think Brady already had 3 Super Bowls. So I think they're pretty much neck and neck. Now, as far as stats, I'm not exactly sure. The stat thing is a whole nother. That's a giant mountain to climb too with Brady, right? I mean, the guy that owns, between him and Peyton Manning, they own almost every record in the NFL, right? So, look, the thing about football is this, Chris. Longevity means a lot. Coaching means a lot. Andy Reid's an offensive genius. But he's getting up there, right? It's pretty old. So we'll see. Brady had Belichick in his 50s. Mahomes has Andy Reid in his late 60s. So how long is that going to last? When does Andy Reid hang him up and say, "I had enough"? So I mean, I think there's a lot of factors there, but no doubt, kudos. Look, they deserved it. They won. The better quarterback prevailed. Period. No matter what anybody wants to say. And I think that next year, I'm looking forward to see what your Lions can do in the division. I know my Giants are going to suck, so it's going to be, I guess I might have to become a pseudo Detroit fan next year.
Hey man, we'll let you on the train. It's all good. Well, this may be us wrapping up our football chatter here for a few episodes. Instead, we're going to be turning to political football, and so we'll get to hear a little bit of Sandy and I mouthing off about some other topics that are near and dear to us beyond sports. But we appreciate you listening to this episode, and we're going to put a bow on it here. We will be back here very soon with another episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody. Peace.